Good afternoon, Frank.
Hi,
It's
Professor Spoder.
it's been a while since we had an opportunity to talk, and a lot of things have been happening. It's been a hot summer, uh, and what has stood out for me more than anything else is the what seems to me, without checking statistics, to be an increasing number of sovereign debt problems. And this seems to me to be something that really is very closely related to the globalization process. And yet, it also seems to me that it's not dealt with in those terms, that it's treated basically, at least the way I read about it in the media, as though it's a new economic problem, and it's a problem that has to be solved in terms of money and economics. Um, and I don't think it can be solved in those terms. And I think that the story of Greece and its sovereign debt that started with the crisis in 2007, I suppose,
Mm.
should be a lesson for everybody, but nobody seems to be dealing with it in those terms. And then every week it seems we hear about another country that has similar problems, but whereas Greece is completely tied up with the euro and the euro countries within the European Union, other countries are not so easy to categorize in those terms, and therefore they get, it doesn't become, there's no diplomatic dimension to it at all, and nobody quite knows what to do about it. So,
Well, go ahead.
no, what's your reaction?
I think that what we're seeing is, as you indeed noted, is something that's an effect of increasing globalization. You have countries that are increasingly getting involved more and more in global transactional activity, and increasingly, you take the case of Europe with the Greeks, for example. I mean, there you have a little bit of a mismatch. You have a very weak economy in a financial, or I should say, a currency economic zone that's dominated by countries such as Germany and France and Finland, where they actually watch the money they spend, and they have a uniform. What they lack, what the European Union lacks, is a uniform budgetary plan. So you have countries such as Greece where you have social services and benefits, and you don't have enough revenue coming in, and that was destined to happen. As you noted, Spain and Portugal and Ireland probably are eventually going to come down that line as well. And then what occurred in Kazakhstan when they just devalued their currency there. I mean, they're an oil-rich country that's suffering from the drop in oil prices, and oil prices are pegged to the U.S. dollar. So I mean, they're in big trouble. And you have China, for example, that is wedded to an economic growth rate, an annual growth rate of 7%. And even though financial observers have long been very skeptical of their government economic numbers, the Chinese government is going to do anything it can do to maintain that growth rate, and that includes devaluing the yuan, because now they'll be able to export more. And it doesn't matter that they have systemic problems that can't even be counted. It doesn't matter that they wiped out the value, 30% or 40% of the value of their stock market over the summer. They're going to meet that growth target. And these are all legitimate concerns. These are decisions that might have been made by reasonable people in Beijing or in Athens or in Kazakhstan, but they're local decisions that were made for local benefit. And therein is the tug of war that we always get to with globalization. On the one hand, you have this globally spreading communication tentacle, but on the other hand, you've got parochial concerns that are governing the seat of power. So where do they meet, if they do at all?
Well, your approach is very interesting. Um, I always like to try to understand globalization in terms of how we got to where we are today, rather than looking at it synchronically and just trying to understand the current situation. Um, Am I right in remembering that the first big bank? I mean, there were banks in Italy in the late medieval period, but the first big bank was the Bank of England in the late 17th century, and it was really the result of an effort for the government to borrow money.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And amusingly, I think it was in order to pay for a war.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And then other countries in Europe did the same thing. And when they couldn't pay their debts, they just said, "Oh, sorry, we can't pay."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And something has changed now that you can't do that. But if you compare Greece with, say, Venezuela, Venezuela, like China, could devalue its current currency. Greece can't.
Right. Greece is trapped. They're trapped.
And this makes me think that really it's not just money we're talking about, it's relationships. And if I lend you something that's very valuable to me, that's a relationship, mm-hmm. Which we are both party to. Mm-hmm. And it's true, you may not give it back to me, but that I should have realized when I lent it to you, that's a possibility. When people lend money, they used to realize that was a problem, and now they think somehow that can't be a problem anymore.
Yeah.
There's something about the modern world that has led us to give the ultimate value to money as something that is, probably more sacred than anything in religion for most people.
Right.
If the value of money is not respected, then everything else is going to fall apart. Mm-hmm. But really, it's the relationships that I would argue are the most valuable thing. And the money really only represents a way of measuring relationships.
Well, I agree with you, and I think.
But the reason we do it that way is it's much simpler to do it that way.
It's much simpler to do it that way.
Just do the math.
Exactly, it's denominational. All right, you can count it. I mean, my God, I mean, look, I sound like Donald Trump, all right, but nevertheless, I mean, I think you're right, and I think French President Hollande might have begun to see this in the beginning of the summer, who was the first voice on the Greek debt crisis, saying, well, wait a minute, mm-hmm. You know, we loaned the money. The loan, that's the verb, we loaned, okay? That doesn't mean we gave them the money. That means we were expecting to get it paid back, but it also means that there was a possibility that we wouldn't get it back. So maybe we need to think about cutting them a break, because the overall harm everybody is talking about is the eventual first step in the road to the dissolution of the Eurozone. And
something that made me sort of reinforced my interest in this is that I looked. I mean, when you need information, you go to Wikipedia, right? So I tried to think of something I could look up in Wikipedia that might give me information on this, and I found that they had an article on government debt. And there's a list of all the governments in the world, or at least a large number of them, and how much debt they have. And it's an interesting list. Of course, the US is at the top.
Yeah.
Greece isn't anywhere near the top, it's in the middle. And the country at the bottom is Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Of the ones that are listed, I don't know how many it was, but it was certainly over 20. And that made me think, well, you know, part of the problem is who wants to lend money to Pakistan?
That is a big part of the problem.
So who wanted to lend money to Greece and why? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the problem with Greece is that there's too much internal debt, but the internal debt was made possible by the external debt.
Right, right. I mean, money is fungible. Once it comes into Athens, then Athens
Yeah.
can do what it likes with it.
So as globalization progresses, we're almost certainly going to see this on a global scale, because one of the things that, I mean, it's obvious with what's going on in the discussion with Trump that, that boundaries don't have the significance they used to have, and the first thing that a Republican candidate wants to do is to claim he can defend the boundaries.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a big problem, because I think that looming over the next hill is China.
Yeah.
Right. There is an awful lot of municipal and provincial level debt over there, an extraordinary amount. Apparently, according to the New York Times, some 282% of gross domestic product is outstanding in debt, some $17 trillion. And most of this debt is secured by real estate of questionable value. We've all read stories of Chinese ghost cities,
Yeah.
with acres of 25-story apartment buildings that have been sitting empty for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't understand why commerce is literally tripping over themselves going to Beijing to execute trade deals with them. I mean,
Well, there's this big luxury trade that is.
well, you read if you're saying that, that means you read some of the stories today, which has evaporated overnight because of the decrease in stock market assets. I was in Paris over the summer, and I saw more Chinese people than I could ever possibly imagine.
My wife doesn't want to go to Europe anymore in the summer because she can't see what she wants to see for the volume of the number of Chinese tourists.
I was very surprised. I was very surprised. I mean, I was happy to see them, but nevertheless, I just was surprised.
Yeah.
I don't know that there'd be that many there now, because their stock holdings have taken a big whack, down by some 40% plus with the devaluation of the currency. It costs a lot more money now to fly to France and back.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. It's a place where this authoritarian managing of the economy. I mean, we've never seen anything like this before.
But we've got a world that's becoming more and more closely interconnected with a currency market.
I understand that, but that the same lack of realization, I wouldn't call it naivete, but the same lack of realization or the willingness to just walk around blinders on that allowed people to keep lending money to Greece, I think is extant today in the relationship with China. All right, because I think people are willfully not looking at things, whether it be the uneven application of law, whether it be the violation of regulatory behavior for environmental and various other things, or whether it be the shenanigans that they're doing with their internal debt. I mean, sooner or later, these things are going to have to be acknowledged, and they're going to have to be dealt with.
But I think that the problem is going to become more widespread and more complicated simply because every country manages its currency in a different way.
That's correct.
How many currencies do we have? And what's going on globally depends on the market between those currencies. And after all, the dollar and the euro and the yuan and other currencies are all being traded all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we put so much faith in the market anyway, but a market collapse, essentially, I suppose what the problem in 2007 was a market collapse, but I think that we're probably heading for much more serious market collapses, because as we can become closer together as a globalizing population of up to 10 billion, we need ways to monitor everything that's going on in a single language, and that's got to be a single currency. There's got to be something political that works globally, and all these things we've made no progress in at all. The only global political institution we have is the Catholic Church.
Right, right. You're right. You're right. I've been thinking back to the 1890s when, in Europe especially, the international agreements on various aspects of trade began to be agreed to, whether it be the width of railroad gauge tracks, sort of codifying the international time zones, how they would be working, codifying things relating to the then embryonic electricity, how that would be classified and categorized. I mean, it really finally put standards in place. Something like that, I mean, we're still operating on the Bretton Woods standards from just after World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, and that just doesn't cut it anymore. There's too much data available. And if you're involved in currency trading, which, as you point out, is the harbinger of the whole economic iceberg, if you're involved in that, I mean, you're going to have access to different quality data than somebody who might be executing a contract with a Chinese company.
I mean, this is the way I would conclude our discussion today, is that we put so much, part of the reason we put so much faith in money is that 2 and 2 make 4.
Right, right.
And we assume that we can talk about the whole world in monetary terms for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, we can't because of all the different currencies. And so we're really deceiving ourselves in by thinking in monetary terms like that.
I agree with you. I know that you're a Bitcoin advocate. So, all right, Professor. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to see you again, and we'll look forward to continuing discussions during the fall.
Good.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.